Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Listen, we've got a lot to happen in 2025 before we need to start finalizing any type of rankings. But maybe you're in a dynasty league or a keeper league and you want to make some offseason deals. Or maybe you're just a fantasy football degenerate and you're already thinking about how am I going to lay out my draft for next season? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at the way too early top 25 wide receiver rankings. Free agency, the draft, potentially some trades, a lot could still happen this offseason. So while this top 25 isn't even close to being locked in stone, still fun to talk about anyway. And all the wide receivers will be ranked in order, but we're going to have them in tiers as well. That way you know what guys are going to be very similar in value in case you're trying to make any deals out there right now. I'm also going to have either an exclamation point or a question mark next to some of these guys because there's some things that could change with them that could really affect their ranking. And then at the end of the top 25, I've got a slew of players that definitely could make their way in if things turn out to be correct for them. The number one overall wide receiver heading into next season is basically going to be the same for everybody, and it's Ja'Marr Chase. In 2024, he was the wide receiver one by an outstanding 73.5 half PPR fantasy points. That is a huge margin. And the number two wide receiver for me right now might be a little shocking for some of you, but it's going to be CeeDee Lamb. And he wasn't that far off this season. He was the wide receiver 4 through week 16 before getting shut down. I feel like next year, maybe a little bit change in philosophy with the offense. We'll see him have a pretty big season once again, as long as him and Dak can stay healthy. Justin Jefferson was the wide receiver 2 this past season with Sam Darnold. I think he's going to be just fine with J.J. McCarthy. Now, Puka Nacua is going to come with a little bit of a question mark. After his injury, when he returned in weeks 8 through 17, he was the wide receiver 2. So we know he puts up fantastic numbers with Matthew Stafford. And Matthew Stafford says he wants to play this season. Will it be in LA? Will they get a new deal done? Will they be able to restructure? Does he end up somewhere else? There's still going to be some question marks with that we'll need to figure out. As of right now, Puka Nacua is going to lock in at number 4, but that could end up changing if something were to happen to Matthew Stafford. And right behind him, Amon-Ra St. Brown. There's going to be a lot of question marks about the change in offensive coordinator from Ben Johnson. Me personally, I'm not nearly as worried because they brought in John Morton to be their offensive coordinator. Now, this past season, he did great work in Denver with Bo Nix in their passing game, but he's very familiar with the Detroit Lions because 2 years ago in Ben Johnson's first season as offensive coordinator, he was a senior analyst and he helped out with a lot of things on the offensive side of the ball. And Ben Johnson has even made it known that John Morton kind of helped him develop his philosophy when it came to game planning and game calling. He's going to end up stepping in and this offense will probably end up being just fine. Tier 2 is going to start with a couple of sophomore studs that had huge rookie seasons. Malik Neighbor is going to be number 6 for me. He was the wide receiver 15 last year with Daniel Jones and Tommy DeVito and Drew Lock. It's really hard to assume that as the wide receiver 15 last season, that Malik Neighbors is going to be worse off with a new starting quarterback, whether that be through the draft, they trade for someone, they bring someone in free agency. There's probably 30 guys that you could play over the options they had last season, and Malik Neighbors would end up being just fine. Where Brian Thomas Jr. last season was actually better with Mac Jones, which is not really what you want to see. From weeks 1 through 9 last season, he was the wide receiver 9. Now, he got a little bit of a bump with Mac Jones because weeks 10 through 18, he was the wide receiver 7. New offensive-minded head coach in Jacksonville is going to do wonders for Brian Thomas Jr., who is an absolute stud. At number 8, Terry McLaurin. I don't think you're going to find too many people with Terry McLaurin ranked higher than what I have him. I've always been a Terry McLaurin fan, and now he's got a true game-changing quarterback to help him reach his full potential. And that's what happened this past season. Not only is Terry McLaurin one of the better deep ball threats in all of football, but he's a guy that where a lot of deep threats seem to give you inconsistent numbers, He didn't. He gave you the consistency with the big playability. And he is right now a top 10 wide receiver in all the National Football League. And for me, he's locked in at number 8 for wide receivers in fantasy football next season. Right behind him with Drake London, I feel like I'm kind of high on him as well. I don't think a whole lot of people realize that over the last 3 weeks of the season, when Michael Penix Jr. was the starter, he was the wide receiver 1. Drake London was getting plenty of looks from Michael Penix. Michael Penix will be the starter next season, and maybe he won't be the wide receiver 1 overall, but finding himself inside the top 10 should be a pretty easy ability. Last season in weeks 1 through 5, Nico Collins was the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football, and he led all the NFL in receiving yards. But then he got hurt. Stephon Diggs got hurt. Tank Dell was banged up. He had a season-ending injury later in the season. The offensive line was banged up and didn't play well. The offensive philosophy kind of changed and just didn't bring a whole lot of consistencies with it. And because of that, CJ Stroud was up and down as well. So that high upside that we saw at the beginning of the year kind of dissipated in the second half. And because of that, I think a lot of people are just going to overlook Nico Collins. I wouldn't do that. His upside is a top 10 receiver every single week. Maybe he's not as consistent as what we saw in weeks 1 through 5, especially considering the fact Tank Dell isn't going to be playing next year. And if you want to bring Stephon Diggs back, he's coming back from an ACL, so how quickly will he come back? There's going to be some questions around Nico Collins that will need to be answered before we lock in his ranking. But for now, he's at the very end of tier 2. Now, we just covered 10 guys that could be absolute game changers for your fantasy roster, but we know fantasy rosters need to be balanced for fantasy championships, and balance starts to come with some of these guys, especially the ones here in tier 3. There's a few guys that could be a secret weapon for your team that are going to help level up your game. Just the same way that Turtle Beach should be your secret weapon to level up your gaming experience. Whether you need a new set of headphones, a new mouse, or keyboard, Turtle Beach has everything you need, including controllers as well. So if you're looking to level up your gaming experience, head on over to Turtle Beach right now and use code HEADLINERS. You're gonna get 10% off your entire order. So if you feel like everyone is a step ahead of you and you can't quite keep up with those sweaty kids that keep dropping into your lobbies, then head on over to Turtle Beach and use them to level up your gaming experience. Kicking off tier 3 will be A.J. Brown at wide receiver 11. In this past season, he didn't finish as a wide receiver 1 overall, but he missed 4 games, and those 4 games cost him another top 12 finish. But if you take a look at where he finished on a points per game basis, he finished tied for wide receiver 9. Jackson Smith-Njigba, slow start to the season, absolute fire ending. In weeks 1 through 8 last season, he was the wide receiver 34. In weeks 9 through 18, he was the wide receiver 9. Geno Smith looked his way to end the season, which would be great heading into 2025 as long as Geno Smith is still the quarterback. That's going to be a question that will need to be answered. Ladd McConkey, weeks 1 through 7, wide receiver 45. Weeks 8 through the rest of the season, wide receiver 8. This offense really got better every single week as the season went on, and it got more and more explosive. Don't be shocked if they try to add somebody else this offseason to help stabilize that offense and give Ladd McConkey someone across from him so he can still go under the radar a little bit more times than not and be a weapon over the middle of the field. For Tyreek Hill, really so far in his career, if he hasn't had Patrick Mahomes and he hasn't had Tua, he hasn't really given you much of anything. Unfortunately, this season, when Tua went down, we saw the same thing happen. But then Tua came back, and they still couldn't get it done. Tyreek Hill only 3 games over 100 yards last season. If he stays in Miami, can Tua stay healthy? And if he doesn't stay in Miami, where does he go? Garrett Wilson's going to have a new coaching staff and hopefully a little bit more stability on offense this season. Even though they hired Aaron Glenn, a defensive guy, he's made it known that he is going to be just involved with the offensive side of the ball, and he's going to be bringing in people to help that side of the ball be competitive. Aaron Rodgers, though, does he come back? Is he the guy next year? A year after being removed from that Achilles injury, does he look a little bit more healthy? Is he just completely washed? Those are also questions that need to be answered with Garrett Wilson. But then right behind him, T. Higgins, we have no idea where he's going to be playing next season. Could he re-sign in Cincinnati? Absolutely, but they need to get a deal done with Ja'Marr Chase too, and they're already paying Joe Burrow a ton of money. He could go somewhere else and be a locked-in-stone wide receiver one. But T. Higgins' biggest issue is staying on the field and staying healthy. So until we know where he's going, I can't quite lock him in as a wide receiver one. Mike Evans and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to have another change at the offensive coordinator position this season. But with that being said, could we lock Mike Evans in for another 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns? If we can, he's probably a little bit closer to wide receiver one status, but we've got a few guys in front of him that might provide a little bit more consistency and might have just a little bit more upside, but there's also guys in front of him that have some bigger question marks. So as of right now, is Mike Evans behind them? Absolutely, but he very easily could jump in front of them because he could end up being a safer bet. Tier 4 is going to take us all the way through to number 25, and we're going to start with DJ Moore. How could you hire Ben Johnson and not have him utilize DJ Moore better than any coach has so far over the course of his career? And year 2 of Caleb Williams should be good for DJ Moore to have a big year. Consistency will just be the biggest thing. Keenan Allen should be gone. Does Cole Kmet get a little bit more involved? Do they bring in another running back to beef up the run game and rely on that a little bit more? And as always, what about the offensive line? Courtland Sutton finishes the wide receiver 13 this past season. Him and Bo Nix had a really strong connection, but 2 question marks for him. Do they bring in somebody else to go on the opposite side of him to help bring off the pressure? Or do the guys that had a good rookie season take a step forward and start to mature a little bit and break out as sophomores? If that happens, then we could see Sutton see a few less targets. Zay Flowers was the wide receiver 10 last season in weeks 1 through 9 before some inconsistencies struck in that offense. And by inconsistencies, Rashad Bateman had a few more looks towards the end of the season, and Mark Andrews started to see some more looks as well. Rashee Rice was the wide receiver 4 in weeks 1 through 3 last season. He had 29 targets during that time frame and averaged 96 receiving yards per game. Yes, he had a bad injury. Hopefully he's back and ready to go to begin the season. But as long as he is, he should be the number 1 target for Patrick Mahomes once again. In 4 of his first 6 healthy games to start 2024, Chris Olave had 80 or more receiving yards. Hopefully he works his way back from his concussion, and hopefully this offense can take off where it started at last year. Jameson Williams, he was the wide receiver 19 this past season, so I'm knocking him down a little bit. I already mentioned it with Amon-Ra St. Brown. I'm not nearly as worried about the offensive side of the ball as I was before the John Morton hire. I really like that hire. Jameson Williams will bring his inconsistencies. He's going to have some bad games, but the good games are going to win you weeks. Marvin Harrison Jr., for him to become a top fantasy option, he's got to get better with contested catches. He's got to get better at the catch point. He's got to start winning a little bit more on the field. We'll see what they do this season to maybe get him going a little bit more often, but a lot of that's going to be on Marvin Harrison himself. And what about Rome Odunze? I'm going to slide him in here at number 25 because he could end up filling a very similar role to what Jameson Williams did for Detroit the last couple of years. Rome Odunze could be that big guy down the field to win some of those contested balls and be a playmaker vertical threat. If that ends up happening in this Bears offense for Ben Johnson, similar to what Jameson Williams did at times, you could end up seeing some inconsistencies for him as well. Where overall for the season, he ends up being pretty solid, but there's going to be some weeks where you're just not into it. Now, I've got several guys that I'm going to fly through here at the end of this show, guys that are kind of just on the outside looking in, and I'm going to give you just a really quick note on each of them, because at the wide receiver position, it's really hard to do rankings. If we're doing the top 25, realistically, there's probably 40 wide receivers that you could make an argument for to fit inside the top 25. And for a lot of these guys that I mentioned, some of them are not going to finish here. Some of these guys that we talk about here in a second will find their way in. And there's probably going to be a couple of guys here or there that maybe nobody's talking about that will find themselves finishing a little bit higher as well. Let's start with Davante Adams. We don't know what team he's going to play for, and we don't know who his quarterback is going to be. George Pickens, we don't know who his quarterback is going to be either. Do they bring back Russell Wilson? Is it going to be Justin Fields? Question marks to answer in Pittsburgh with that one. DK Metcalf, I already mentioned it with JSN. Who's the quarterback going to be? Do they give Geno Smith another year? And on top of that, JSN's the wide receiver one now, not DK Metcalf. Cooper Kupp, have injuries caught up to him? Has he lost a step? Will he be on a new team? It's hard to put him inside the top 25 right now. Jordan Addison, a full season of TJ Hawkinson being back, plus a new quarterback in JJ McCarthy that might have eyes for Justin Jefferson a little bit more often. Jordan Addison could have some up and downs and maybe wouldn't be as consistent as we saw for some spurts this past year. Jacoby Myers, here's the question. Second target on the team right behind Brock Bowers, and who is the quarterback going to be? Is it Aiden O'Connell, or do they do something in the draft to grab one of the top guys? Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith, really for them, it's about inconsistencies. As of right now, the number 2 option, Jerry Jeudy, who's going to be his quarterback in Cleveland this year? That's going to be a big question that needs to be answered. Down the stretch, he had some really good weeks. If it's Dorian Thompson-Robinson, though, don't even think about it. That's not going to work out. We've got 3 guys that definitely could be inside the top 25, but a lot of it depends on how they come back from injury. Chris Godwin, Brandon Ayuk, and Stephon Diggs. We don't know when they're going to be 100%. If they're not 100% to begin the year, then they're probably not top 25 wide receivers. Now, at some point in the year, they absolutely could be. But if we're ranking these guys based on how we think they could end up finishing, any missed games is going to make it tough for them. Deebo Samuel is a guy that could be inconsistent at times, and his ranking is going to also depend on Brandon Ayuk. But what about Juwan Jennings? He ended up looking really fantastic at points last season. And speaking of him, he's at the very end of this list as well. Brock Purdy had an eye for him. If no Brandon Ayuk to start the year, does Juwan Jennings become a top 25 wide receiver to begin 2025? Josh Downs and Michael Pittman Jr., both of these guys being together in Indianapolis. Now, Josh Downs was probably the wide receiver 1 last season. Anthony Richardson is working with the quarterback coach that worked with Josh Allen prior to his breakout on his mechanics and different things that he could do. So it is feasible to think that Anthony Richardson could take a step forward this year. And if that ends up happening, then both of these guys could end up being fantasy viable. But until we see a little bit more from Anthony Richardson, both of these guys are going to be some shots in the dark that you're probably going to take as like a wide receiver 3 or 4 later in your draft. But Headliner Nation, there's definitely a lot of discussion to be had when it comes to rankings, especially this early in the offseason. So why don't you let us know in the comments down below? Every single person that watches this video, I've got a challenge for you. Leave a comment down below and let me know 2 players. 1 player that should be higher and 1 player that should be lower, and only 1 sentence explanation for both of those guys. I'm making a challenge out there to number 1, comment on the video, but also number 2, keep it short and sweet and give us 1 sentence with your thoughts on some guys that are either too high or too low. Make sure you also hit that like button for us. We are here all off season long. And I'll tell you, Headliner Nation, it's a struggle for us in the off season to watch all of these videos only get maybe 1,000 to 2,000 views. We put in a lot of work over the off season, so we'd appreciate it if you stuck around and keep checking out some of the videos. And even if you're not watching a whole lot of videos, please make sure you're hitting the like button while you're here to help us out in the algorithm so more people find the Headliner Nation and we can get those views up during the off season. And make sure you subscribe if you're new here to the channel. But for now, Headliner Nation, I'm going to get out of here. Appreciate everybody who sticks around all off season long. Stay safe. Stay healthy. I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.